September 29th, 2020. This is a work session of the Portland City Council. And without further ado, I will jump right in with my introduction. Colleagues and Bureau Directors, thank you for joining us today. And of course, we're excited to have Commissioner-elect Carmen Rubio with us. This is part one of a two-part training being conducted by the Western State Center. Early last year, the City Council unanimously co-sponsored a resolution condemning white supremacist and alt-right hate groups. In that resolution, the city made a commitment to develop training on the history as well as the impacts of white supremacy. Since then, council offices have worked collaboratively with the Western State Center to develop the first phase of the trainings, which is for city leadership. It couldn't come at a more imperative time. And the city's made a commitment to becoming an anti-racist institution. These two trainings will provide city leadership with the context to understand the white nationalist movements, and it'll also provide the tools necessary to effectively respond to the very real threats that they pose to our communities, as well as to local government. We plan on developing an anti-white supremacy training for all city staff in the very near future. So with that, I'd like to introduce our instructors today. We have Eric Ward, Amy Hartsfeld-Koppel, and Lindsay Schubiner from the Western State Center, and Leisha Brooks from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Thank you all for being here and conducting this training for us. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler. Good morning. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for this Western State Center training series on understanding and responding to white nationalism. We're very excited for this opportunity. We believe this is unique among city leadership across the country, and we hope this becomes a useful blueprint for other municipalities and jurisdictions to explore the impacts of anti-democratic movements on our democratic institutions. We begin our session today by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their home along the Columbia River. Everything we discuss today sits firmly within this recognition, and it is important to take a moment to note the calls for recognition, reckoning, and reparations that are still unmet, and to honor the promises still to be kept. My name is Amy Hartsfeld-Koppel. I serve as the Deputy Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives at Western State Center. As you shared, Mayor Wheeler, I'm joined today by my colleagues, Eric K. Ward, Western State Center Executive Director, Lindsay Schubiner, our Program Director, who leads our national work countering white nationalism, and our movement colleague and dear friend, Leisha J. Brooks, Chief of Staff for the Southern Poverty Law Center. We'd like to do a little quick housekeeping for today's session before I turn it over to Eric to open the session with framing, shared language, and historical context. Next slide, please. First, a little bit about Western State Center. We're a 33-year-old nonprofit civil rights organization based in the Pacific Northwest and Mountain States. And we serve as a national hub to engage partners committed to strengthening inclusive democracy. Since 1987, we've played a catalytic role building people-centered movements for social justice. At the center, we feel like the times we're in call for nothing less than a 21st century civil rights movement. We know that where there's fear, there's someone organizing hate. White nationalists certainly haven't stopped organizing during the pandemic, and neither can we. Our work to counter anti-Semitism, white nationalism, and structural inequality has never been more important. Our programs at Western State Center span four core pillars: building movements, developing leaders, shifting culture, and defending democracy. And we focus on leading rapid response and narrative shift work, providing training, education, and tools to organizers and community leaders, and supporting interconnected leaders to help build a world where everyone can live, love, worship, and work free from bigotry and fear. Our biggest program, Momentum, works to equip communities, civil society, and local government with tools and analysis to effectively counter the rise of white nationalism, anti-democratic movements, and other social movements that exploit bigotry and intolerance.
Hey, Amy, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Commissioner Udaly is having some troubles logging in. Could we just
I'm
break
here.
for a second? Oh, she's on. Okay.
No, I've been here for a few minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor.
Great. All right. Thank you. Sorry, Amy, to interrupt.
No, please, and jump in too. So as much as we'd like to do full introductions, and next slide too, please, we're certainly mindful of time. We recognize that you all work together. So we just ask that during the group discussion portions, when you jump in with a reflection or question, that you please introduce yourself briefly by name and your role in the city for our benefit. And of course, there's no need for the mayor and commissioners to introduce themselves. Thank you again to Mayor Wheeler, commissioners, and city staff and leaders for making this training possible and holding space for this conversation. A special thanks to Nicole Grant and Asena Lawrence for working closely with our staff over the last 2 years to bring this training to life, to explore ways that Western State Center can support the city, and of course, your work to support the council's unanimous adoption of a resolution in early 2019 condemning white supremacist and alt-right hate groups. Next slide, please. As you know, this is a two-part training series spanning today and next Tuesday to provide context and analysis to equip participants to understand white nationalist, alt-right, and anti-democratic movements and better respond to the threats they pose to our democratic institutions. Our broader learning objectives for these two sessions are to analyze the impact of white nationalist and alt-right movements on democratic practice and the city of Portland specifically, to identify different tactics and strategies used by distinct anti-democratic groups, and finally, to identify shared solutions and actions through policies, regulations, and political power to protect the city of Portland against attempts by anti-democratic groups to undermine our city's institutions and the rights and safety of diverse communities in Portland. Our flow this morning is an introduction to white nationalist, alt-right, and paramilitary movements by Eric with historic and present day context, an overview of the goals, strategies, and tactics of these movements by Lindsay and me, a briefing on alt-right paramilitary groups' activities in Portland by Leisha, followed by group discussion, and finally a closing by Eric and the mayor. In addition to a 30-minute discussion we have planned, we'll be pausing for several intervals throughout the session for your questions and reflections. Next slide, please. Now I'm pleased to introduce Eric Ward. Eric is a national expert on the relationship between hate violence and preserving democratic institutions, governance, and inclusive societies. And he brings nearly 30 years of expertise in community organizing, philanthropy to his role as Western State Center's executive director. Eric also serves as a senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward. Originally from Los Angeles, Eric began his civil rights work when the white nationalist movement was engaged in violent paramilitary activity that sought to undermine democratic governance in the Pacific Northwest. Eric founded and directed a community project to expose and counter hate groups and respond to bigoted violence with the Community Alliance of Lane County in the early 90s. And then he went on to serve with the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment from 1994 to 2002, where Eric worked with government leaders, civil rights campaigners, business leaders, and law enforcement officials to help establish over 120 human dignity task forces in Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, and Wyoming. Working at the Center for New Community as National Field Director from 2003 to 2011, Eric assisted immigrant rights advocates in addressing the growing influence of xenophobia on public policy. Most recently, Eric has worked in national philanthropy, serving as the program executive at the Atlantic Philanthropies U.S. Reconciliation and Human Rights Program, where he led grant making in immigration and national security and rights. Then Eric led grant making efforts to combat inequality as a Ford Foundation program officer until 2017, before he moved back to Oregon to lead Western State Center. Eric has been quoted and cited extensively by national media, is the editor of 3 published works, gives frequent keynote addresses on these topics, and is the author of the 2017 essay, Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism. I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I want to thank all the organizers and those in attendance today. I particularly want to thank the Portland City Commissioners and Mayor Wheeler for their strong leadership this past weekend, a direct fulfillment of the action the City Council took 19 months ago in February of 2019. At that time, the City Council unanimously passed a landmark resolution condemning white supremacy and alt-right hate groups. The resolution serves as a model for other cities and counties around the region, as you are aware. And here we are today for the training we have all committed to. As a result of this training, participants will be able to deepen their understanding of the impact of white nationalist and alt-right movements and the impact they have on democratic institutions, including municipal government. We will explore the origins, tactics, and strategies used by racialized extremist groups and prepare city bureaus to explore action that through policy, regulation, and political power, protect the city of Portland against attempts of social movements to undermine city institutions and the rights and safety of the diverse communities that make up Portland, Oregon. When I'm asked, how do we achieve this? I believe that the facts are becoming well established, and that brings us to this past weekend. We are all relieved last weekend's Proud Boy rally was met with a unified response from our community. And as a result, de-escalated the tensions mounting since the deadly confrontations on August 29th. Attendance at the Proud Boys rally numbered in only the hundreds instead of the 20,000 they projected. Portlanders turned out in far greater numbers for two peaceful counter-protests. This came at the end of a week in which the Portland community, including elected officials, business, and community groups, united to reject hate and violence. We commend city, county, and state leaders for responding. We commend counter-protesters for taking a strong, visible, and unified stand against hate. And we commend law enforcement for keeping Proud Boy protesters separated from counter-protesters. What have we learned from this past weekend? There are likely many lessons we can draw on from this past weekend, but I want to focus on just a few. When city and civic leadership aligns, the power to disrupt the lives of Portlanders is denied to extremists and paramilitaries coming into the city. When civic and civic leadership does not align, our communities suffer. Anti-democratic tendencies in and around the Portland area are desperate for attention and relevance. And the risk of violence remains high, and it will likely increase as we approach the national elections in November and the expected inauguration day in January. While we can't control or influence all factors related to these incursions, it is also clear that appearance of biased policing or the disproportionate use of force against counter-protesters and media will only serve to undercut the hard-won successes achieved by city leadership. Even still, it is no surprise to anyone listening today that my overall assessment matches what you all have already come to understand. And that is that even under the best conditions, Portland will continue to wrestle with the clear danger to our city posed by paramilitaries, hate groups, and vigilantes for years to come. Rather than accept this fact with alarm, we should embrace it with opportunity and possibility. Each unwelcomed and uninvited incursion by these vigilantes and other anti-democratic tendencies is an excuse to provide leaderful governance to a city in which all residents can live, love, and work free from fear. That is what it means to lead in this moment. Like you, I am not here to point fingers or assign blame. It's easy to point fingers, providing one never points at themselves. In truth, Portland faces a highly complex situation over a decade in the making, and the challenges are not ours alone. There are a national dilemma, and whether Portland chooses to be or not to be, we have been made a proving ground for attacks on inclusion, equity, and quite frankly, the right to be eccentric, imaginative, and quirky. That's the city that makes us proud to call Portland home. What we are facing here has been radically escalated by out-of-town forces, making deliberate incursions into Portland, and more disturbingly, a sitting US president recklessly fanning the flames of vigilantism and political violence. But while we can sit here today and point fingers at these extremists, we have to accept that these external forces are only exploiting vulnerabilities that are ours to address. There are things all of us can and must do better. You as city leaders are bearing the brunt of our collective failures and are even being targeted by threats of violence from paramilitaries and threats of legal charges by the Trump administration. But no one is exempt from responsibility when it comes to making our democracy in Portland work for everyone. All of us in Oregon, including civil society, business, faith communities, philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, media, and social media personalities would do well to look in the mirror and examine our own culpability in this moment. Certainly there are things we wish that all of us had done sooner, and we will continue to, and we should receive our fair share of lumps and criticisms. That is also what it means to be a leader in this moment. But for today, the more important issue than who's to blame or credit for what did or didn't happen is what do we do now? I have 3 suggestions. First, we need to leverage all the institutions that make up civil society in Portland. And those civil institutions need to work with our elected officials and city bureau heads to address this threat. It is time for a citywide task force made up of community, business, faith, educators, and governmental leaders whose mandate is to incubate and lift up the most creative solutions to countering hate and political violence. Second, we need government community alignment that publicly commits to the de-escalation of physical violence and confrontation over escalation, and it needs to come from all sectors. And 3, while it's not my job today to lay out policy solutions, all policies in place within Portland should be assembled, reviewed, and assessed for relevance to this moment and opportunity. At the end of the day, though, all of us should remember that policy solutions will only succeed if they are grounded in a clear understanding of what we are facing today. I don't say these things from a place of arrogance. I say it as someone who has been on both the receiving end and the giving end of political violence. I've been the target of hate crimes many times in my life. I understand the survival instinct of fear. And there were far too many years that I believed that it was a good idea to get into direct physical confrontations with Nazis and other white nationalists. That's simply how I felt at the time. Today, though, I choose instead to feel for those on both the right and left, and everyone in between who feels marginalized, disenfranchised by the system that they perceive or is rigged against them. I feel for the first responders who can't afford to live in the city and who are worn out by the multiple crises. I feel for the elected officials who are facing death threats and who get far more critique than real partnership and support. I feel for those physically brutalized on the streets of Portland by both government and private actors for merely demanding an inclusive community free of racism. For myself, I've come to believe that this isn't about left or right, or conservative or liberal, or about centering the needs and values of my ideology over the entire Portland community. I choose instead to learn to care more about the common good than who's right or wrong. And that's what I believe is likely true for the majority of participants here today as well. That's why we are here today. It is our next opportunity to live the values adopted by our city council: anti-racism, equity, transparency, communication, collaboration, and fiscal responsibility. I think all of us intrinsically understand why these 3 steps are necessary, but I think it bears repeating. Anti-democratic movements threaten the values we share as Portlanders. They undermine the rule of law and endanger our residents, our public servants, and the ability of all of us to focus on addressing the actual concerns of those who live here. A global pandemic, an historic economic recession, the need for quality education, racial equity, unemployment, and affordable housing, to name but a few. But I also need to take a minute to address the question of violence on both sides that each of us wrestles with. In no way should my remarks be construed today to suggest that I am denying the complexity to the many sources of violence that have been visited upon our city. To be clear, I and Western State Center condemn violence against persons, wherever it derives from, across the political binary known as the right and left in America. Each of us understands that there are individuals across the political spectrum willing to commit physical violence to advance their cause, or provocateurs who may appear to espouse one set of beliefs while acting as agents for another, or those who have taken advantage of a few individuals who struggle with mental illness and are susceptible to recruitment and calls for violence. But neither should my remarks suggest that I'm here today to ignore the painful impact of property destruction, vandalism, and fires, and what it has meant for those who own businesses. But let's be clear, it is wrong to confuse or conflate property damage with the taking, endangering, injuring, or threatening of human lives. Not only is it wrong to pretend any kind of equivalency, it's dangerous for our city. It falsely feeds into the alienated, paranoid fantasies of armed vigilantes. A study of murder and extremism in the US, published in 2017, found that 71% of the extremist-related fatalities in the US between 2008 and 2017 were committed by members of the far right or white nationalist movements. During that same 10-year period, 51 police officers were killed by far-right extremist groups, in contrast to 11 officers killed by those claiming far-left or Black nationalist beliefs. Focusing on the current era of violence in response to racial justice protests, while there have only been a handful of incidents where alt-right activists have been attacked, leaves us severely weakened. There is simply no comparison between the thousands of everyday Oregonians who are standing up for racial justice by using their constitutionally guaranteed rights of speech and assembly to make our democracy work for everyone, and those who are organizing to use violence to spread racism and bigotry in our community. The last thing that needs to be said before we get into the specifics of the subject at hand today is this. I think we all get it. We're scared and we're terrified by the moment we find ourselves in. We are individually and collectively worn down and worn out from the multiple challenges facing us in these times. Public health, mental health, environmental health, economic health, and the health of our democratic institutions and constitutional protections, all imperiled at this time. But you or I cannot proceed from a place of fear, because fear is scarcity. And good governance isn't about scarcity. It is about ensuring our communities and those in it have an abundant life filled with opportunity. And that simply can't be done from a place of fear. Rather, we should see ourselves as the victim of circumstances beyond our control. We need to see ourselves as agents of change in a time of extraordinary opportunity. This is our moment, and what we do in this moment matters. Whether our city and our democracy thrive or are taken down by white nationalists or armed paramilitaries is not up to the militias in the streets or the folks breaking windows. It's not up to the right or left, or Democrats or Republicans, or conservatives or liberals. It's up to us, democratically elected leaders and civil society, who want to prioritize the common good for all. That's the test, and we need to pass this test. So let's begin this test by going over just a few definitions before turning the mic over to my colleagues. I want to talk about the origins and goals of white nationalism and white supremacy. These are items and definitions that are familiar with you and to you, but worth revisiting. White supremacy is a system of subjugation of people of color to preserve the privilege and power of white people. It dates back to our nation's founding, with the genocide and forced removal of Native people and the shameful institution of slavery. White nationalism, on the other hand, emerged as a backlash in the wake of the 1960s civil rights movement. While it descends from white supremacy, it is not a system, but a social movement. A social movement committed to overthrowing the US government to establish a white-only nation. And anti-Semitism forms its theoretical core. Why anti-Semitism? Because Jews function for today's white nationalists, as they often have for anti-Semites throughout the centuries, as an existential and racialized demon, stirring an otherwise changing and heterogeneous pot of lesser evils. In the Turner Diaries, a 1978 dystopian novel by white nationalist leader William Pierce, he wrote that much of the problems facing the white nationalist movement could be defined as a war against the Jews. We cannot underestimate the power of anti-Semitism. The Turner Diary serves as a blueprint for much of the organizing, propaganda, and violent direct action witnessed today by far-right extremists. The novel takes place in the near future and follows the triumph of a clandestine white supremacist organization that overthrows the United States and drops atomic weapons on both Israel and New York City. The hardcore of the white nationalist movement sees white supremacy, that system, as a failed experiment and one not worth revisiting. White nationalists and its closely aligned alt-right coalition often have deeply anti-government ideologies, making them dangerous to any who come in contact with them. We should understand in this moment that the white nationalist movement is national, but it was in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming that neo-Nazis in the 1980s attempted to carve out as a territorial boundary this region as a future white-only state. And self-identified Aryans from around the country began to converge into Oregon and other states with nothing short of white national sovereignty as their goal. White nationalist leader and Aryan Nations organizer Robert Miles declared at one point, saying, "We shall begin to form the new nation, even while in the suffocating embrace of Zog." In white nationalist parlance, the United States is the Zog, or the Zionist occupational government. But we also need to take a minute to look at the origins of the alt-right movement. The contemporary alt-right, named by white nationalist Richard Spencer, brought anti-Semitic and bigoted thought and imagery to an unprepared audience on the internet. Incubated by white nationalist leadership, the alt-right is a coalition of groupings and political tendencies that aren't all explicitly white nationalist. Participation ranges from hardcore neo-Nazis to Proud Boys, to Boogaloo Boys, bikers, Patriot Prayer, and 3%ers, to name a few. Added into this already dangerous mix is the rise of armed paramilitary formations. Here in the Pacific Northwest, as we all understand, armed paramilitaries are well established. There have been the big headline-making moments like the armed 2014 standoff in Nevada between the Bundy family and law enforcement. That led directly to a 2016 41-day occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. It was in the Northwest that nascent militia movements, notorious in the 1990s after standoffs between white nationalists and the FBI in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, and Waco, Texas, declared war on their country loudly enough that they could no longer be ignored. The prefix in paramilitary needs to be understood, not only as resembling the military, but also as a parallel army. The growing visibility of these paramilitary formations constitutes an authoritarian force that is not elected, neither transparent, nor accountable to citizens. Contemporary paramilitary groups have been functioning in and around the surrounding suburban and rural areas of Portland since the birth of the Posse Comitatus in Portland, Oregon, with barely any institutional challenge. The presence of these formations creates the potential for a cycle of violence. Here's how some groups have responded to being threatened by armed paramilitary groups: by creating their own. When we see headlines that read, "If others have rifles, we'll have rifles," why US leftist groups are taking up arms, we all should understand we are sitting on a tinderbox. The propensity towards violence for any individual paramilitary formation may vary over time, but the cumulative effect of the sustained and growing paramilitary movement is a chilling of public space and democratic function. The effect is even more pronounced for all those who don't look like members of the paramilitary: Indigenous people, Blacks, people of color, religious minorities, immigrants, and refugees. While we didn't get here overnight, the paramilitary movement is now in a mass building stage, aided by elected leaders and public employees retweeting fake Antifa conspiracy stories. As you know, in these recent weeks, these rumors led to paramilitary mobilizations, harassing and interfering with wildfire evacuees and media, which endangered already traumatized people and sapped the resources of first responders. We need to be clear about what's at stake here. Alex Newhouse of the Center for Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism said recently that we must understand that these paramilitary groups continue to take political violence and mainstream it in such a way that it becomes normal. This is a dangerous moment that we find ourselves in. What has all of this meant for Portland? Well, when people ask me, as they often do, why Portland has been such a nexus for these groups, I'm reminded of a jarring moment from an earlier Patriot Prayer rally. It wasn't an act of violence. It was a conversation between an alt-right activist and a bystander who asked him why he was there. I've told this story, and I believe I told it when the resolution before the council was adopted, but it's worth repeating. The alt-right activist said, "You can't say you don't want us here. You can say you don't want us here, but you're doing something we could never do. You're getting rid of your Black population." He undeniably had a point. While we must draw a clear moral line against hate and political violence, we also must remember that one of the keys to our success is to address the underlying systemic discrimination and social alienation that allows the alt-right, white nationalists, and others to perceive that they are welcome and have a base from which to recruit from. Oregon, unfortunately, has a long history of white supremacy, as cited in your own resolution adopted by the City Council in 2019. This portion of our history and present remains with us, but I'm deeply grateful for all of you listening today who work to address these issues. And our yesterdays and todays, we should understand, should not be our tomorrow. And that brings me back to the adopted policy of the city, the resolution that this training is here to move from theory into action. And I quote, "Our values are rooted in abundance, respect, safety, inclusivity, and equity, and we derive our strength from our diversity. The city of Portland is proud to stand united against those who propagate hate and incite fear and violence in our community. And I and others in civil society see it as our opportunity to join you working together to ensure civil and human rights for all." I have a few more points that I'd like to make today before turning it over. What I'd like to say to you all in this moment is to take a deep breath. We should understand that it is our chance to commit to constructing a political center in Portland, one that seeks to broaden community consensus in support of inclusive democracy and de-escalation. This is about winning the peace, not the war. The success of this training will not be what we attended and listened. It will not be because we attended and listened today. It will be the people in government and civil society who we reach out to, the sectors each department and bureau involves, engaging the historically disenfranchised communities that we listen to, and exciting the city's incredible, resourceful imagination. To every elected official participating today, thank you. And please know, you need to hold those of us within civil society and within social movement spaces accountable too, regardless of where we fall on the political spectrum. Demand our leadership as much as we demand it of you. To draw on the words of the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, let's fight for the things we care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join us. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Eric. We were going to take a brief pause right now for questions, reflections, and comments for about 5 to 7 minutes before we move on to the next section.
Commissioner Hardesty, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Eric, so much for that vital information and historic context. Would you mind repeating the 3 things that you said that we as City Council should do?
Absolutely. Happy to. And I'm just scrolling right here to the 3s. Here we go.
Started with a citywide task force, I think.
That's right. Here we go. So I am scanning my very long words, but I will come back to it. The first thing, here we go. Let me just go to find here. Sorry about that. Yeah, I am lost in my text here. Commissioner Hardesty, give me a second. Here we go. Okay. So the first is, thank you for your patience. The first is we need to leverage all institutions that make up civil society in Portland to work with elected leaders and the city bureau heads to address this threat. And I mean the business sector, faith educators, government leaders, business, and community, which actually has been very present. But I think that there has been too much responsibility heaped upon city leaders without the offer of support. This is just a moment where all civil society needs to lean in. The second was the need for government community alignment that publicly commits verbally to the de-escalation of physical violence and confrontation over escalation, and that needs to come from all sectors. And the third was to review, assemble, and assess all city policy to understand its relevance to this moment and to the opportunity we find ourselves in.
Thank you.
Commissioner Fritz.
I just want to say thank you, Director Ward. I thought that was really, really helpful. It was encouraging. It hit on everything, that many of the things that we've been hearing, and pulled them all together in a way that was really helpful and meaningful to me. So that's all I have to say is thank you.
Thank you.
I want to just jump in as well, and thank you for your comments. You made a statement that I agree with wholeheartedly, and that was that you said that there was no moral justification for violence as an ends to a political means. I'm paraphrasing you. Do you find that there is increasing disagreement with that premise that you and I both agree with? And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I think there is growing disagreement. There's deep alienation in our society, and it's hard to imagine unless one is experiencing it. There are 51 plus million Americans out of work, and Oregon has felt the impact of that global recession harder than many states in the country. Some data that I've read has suggested that perhaps 30% of folks who were employed pre-COVID are now on unemployment or off the unemployment books altogether. It's a deep crisis. So there is that. And then there's also the fact that every value conversation in America becomes politicized, and politicized in a way to drive partisanship rather than solutions. That leaves people bewildered and not understanding how to solve issues through democratic practice. The third is alienation with our institutions, both government and non-government. They are no longer seen as ways of addressing problems or confusion. And so it has allowed others to suggest alternatives. Usually the alternative is violence that actually has nothing to do with solving the complex problems. So I think you're correct. There is an increasingly, there's an increase in the tendency to rely on violent confrontation as the illusion of social change and social equity and opportunity in America. The way we address it, though, is by creating real alternatives to that. And that is one of the blessings and the power and the burden of local government, is that it actually does have the creativity and the imagination and the network to provide those alternatives. But at the end of the day, the rest of civil society has to join with local government in order to make that work, to make alternatives to violence work.
Thank you. Chief Boone has her hand raised.
Thank you, Mayor. Eric, I have a question for you. Just growing up in Oregon, and as you're going over the history when it came to the neo-Nazi movement, white supremacists in the Northwest, it impacts more than just at the local level. And one of the things growing up and even having this training here with, elected officials and the institutions that make up government and serve. In Portland, there is a very intentional and purposeful effective to really, center equity in the city's values. And what's going to change in the next 10 years if regional partners or where the neo-Nazis or alt-right or militias are still gathering in the rural areas? How do we address that as a state? Because that's where they're amassing, that's where they're training, that's where they're recruiting.
Yes.
So is there an effort on a regional and statewide level to also get the training out to other elected officials around the state and other cities?
Yes, this is a great question. And I also just want to personally thank you in particular for your leadership, which I know it has not been an easy moment. I would say that we are facing a national and regional and state problem. Portland is the proving ground for other people's issues. I'm not saying we don't have our own issues, but we have also become the proving ground for other people's issues. There is a level of anger towards government, and particularly towards liberal government in this moment. That is driven by a number of different factors that I'd love to go into, growing inequality being one of them, but also a belief in authoritarianism or might makes right. You are correct that outside the Portland city jurisdictions, there are documented cases of far-right elements taking over volunteer fire departments is one example that comes to mind, engaging in paramilitary trainings and practices that are then unleashed here in Portland, Oregon on its citizens. At the end of the day, there will need to be a regional and national response. But what I believe is that the more that Portland's government and non-governmental entities can find alignment with one another, the more pressure that will be felt by regional, state, and national elements to be more responsive to what is a national crisis. At the end of the day, though, municipal and regional governments outside of Portland and state governments have a responsibility. The state of Washington has a responsibility to work with Portland city leaders to address this issue. So do those communities outside of Portland who also pay the cost of this. We should be clear, there's not only the physical cost, and there's not only the mental and the emotional exhaustion. Joey Gibson and others within the Patriot Prayer movement have said several times that one of the goals of targeting Portland is to exhaust it economically. These incursions have real economic cost on the city of Portland. It dictates who is excited about moving here for work and who isn't, what businesses feel comfortable here and who does not. It strikes at the very heart of diversity, a challenge that Portland has struggled with throughout its history. Diversity in a diverse community that brings along with it possibilities and opportunities doesn't happen. And if the economics and the economy of Portland suffer, we all know and understand that the economies of Southwest Washington and the rest of Oregon and Western Idaho are soon to follow that same road. So they should all be invested. But I believe the way we get there is through finding our own alignment and strengthening our own alignment first.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, everyone. If it's all right, I think we'll move into the next section. We're going to have plenty of time throughout the remainder of the training for discussion and conversation.
Lindsay,
Could I ask one more question before you move on?
yeah,
So
Commissioner Hardesty.
I wanted to ask Eric, So what? So my question is, America is browning, and we know that the browner America gets, the more some of these fringe groups lose their minds. And so, how does that impact what we're seeing on the ground here in Oregon right now? And tying it into, of course, the economic instability that so many people are feeling. Is this now a great opportunity to blame Black people and immigrants and everybody else because of the economic insecurity folks are feeling?
Yes, I think Commissioner Hardesty, let's make sure I'm not on mute. Okay. Commissioner Hardesty, I think you are so on point. The aligning demographic anxiety, right? The fear of demographic change is certainly providing fuel for white nationalist recruitment and violence. I want to say something first, though. You know, anxiety is not a bad thing. We paint anxiety as this terrible thing. Anxiety is actually fairly natural. I feel it right now, speaking to you all as commissioners and mayor, the mayor right now. I feel it when I walk into a space that's unfamiliar, right? So we feel anxiety. Demographic anxiety also occurs and is actually quite natural. What's made it nefarious is that white nationalists have taken what is natural and placed it into this category of something of akin to an existential threat, right? What we know is then that fear of existential threat coupled with the deep economic recession we are experiencing provides just the perfect storm for the justification of violence, even if it's actually not the cause of violence. My sense is that one of the things that the city can do and is doing, I think, under your leadership and the leadership of the mayor and other commissioners and bureau leads, is to continue to lead into the issue of racial equity and systemic discrimination, right? By dealing and addressing head-on segregation in transportation, housing, employment, education, and in health access. What we do is we create a city that is committed to building racial intimacy. And many studies have shown that intimacy is the best inoculation against the exploitation of demographic anxiety. The more that people come into contact with one another, whether it's through cultural means such as sports, right? Whether it's through the arts, or whether it's just through working with one another, what we see is an ebbing and a de-escalation of the demographic anxiety that leads to racial violence. So at the end of the day, while we may not be able to control everything the paramilitary organizations do, we can control, right, the systems within our own community that make the actions of those movements less impactful. And I think that's some of the work that the council is taking on, but I would say for all bureau leads to understand that is your sweet spot in terms of building an effective response.
Thank you so much. Are there any final questions, or are we all right to move on? Great. Thank you so much, everyone. So we're now going to shift into a brief segment to discuss the strategies and tactics of white nationalist, alt-right, and paramilitary movements before we next move to a discussion of the groups active in Portland specifically and the impacts that they've had. So Eric has outlined the distinct origins of these movements, and it's important to recognize their different strategies and tactics as part of that, along with some of the similarities. So there's a chart in our slide deck, if staff wouldn't mind putting that up. Great, thank you. Next slide. There we go. So this is a chart that I've always found helpful, adapted from the work of colleague Stephen Gardner. And it analyzes groups that are part of the broader white nationalist and alt-right movements based on their messages and on their tactics. First, whether they rely on coded racist language or more overt bigoted messages. And secondly, whether they attempt to work within the political and legal system or outside of it. All of these groups and movements are trying to build political power, but each group's specific approach also has to inform how we respond to them. So for instance, the anti-immigrant group Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR, was founded by a white nationalist who wanted to reduce immigration in order to maintain and expand a white racial majority in the United States. In the present day, FAIR has sought to distance itself from that type of overt bigotry and relies more on coded racist messages so that the groups can work within the political and legal system, developing relationships with members of Congress and working to influence immigration legislation. On the other hand, a group like the Proud Boys don't necessarily attempt to work within the political system. They use more violent methods of threats, intimidation, and direct political violence. But they do still evaluate the political context and make strategic decisions about how and where to use violence and threats to achieve their aims of building political power and intimidating their political opponents. There are other examples on the chart here, and well-informed people could disagree about the exact placement of a specific group on the chart. But the point is that groups like FAIR on one hand and the Proud Boys on the other hand pose unique threats to an inclusive democracy and require different responses, both from a messaging and a policy standpoint. Groups within these broader white nationalist and alt-right movements can also serve to reinforce each other's aims, even if they're not directly coordinating. For instance, energy and ideas from more violent groups near the bottom of the chart can filter up and drive policy goals promoted by groups that work within the political system or elected and appointed officials even who share similar political aims. So with that in mind, I want to talk specifically about the approach to their political opposition taken by alt-right paramilitary groups like the Proud Boys. Proud Boys attempt to portray their political opponents as violent actors who do not believe in laws or religion and are a danger, especially to law enforcement. So for instance, a Proud Boys leader recently asked for prayers because the Proud Boys were headed into what he called demonic territory this weekend, referring to Portland. He said that Portland had, quote, embraced evil, and characterized the Proud Boys rally, the one that was just this past Saturday, as making a, quote, stand against rapists, murderers, and pedophiles, end quote. They also glorify violence against their political opponents and frequently share videos of violence against counter-protesters with glowing statements. This creates conditions ripe for actual acts of violence and intimidation of those who disagree with them. And finally, a key but unspoken strategy is one of what some people call accusations in a mirror, accusing their political opponents of exactly what they are doing to or saying about them. So we've seen this, for example, in alt-right and paramilitary statements accusing their opponents of political violence and raising the specter of the quote-unquote violent left, for instance, when in fact, the far right is responsible for the vast majority of political violence, including every extremist killing in 2018 as one example. A different example is a group called Patriot Front, which is an example of an overtly white nationalist group that uses some of these similar strategies, but in different ways, right? For instance, rather than using direct confrontation for the purposes of intimidation, Patriot Front relies significantly on anonymous flyering. They have put stickers or stencils up of their messages in Portland 12 times just this year. And this is a strategy that still spreads fear and works to mainstream their bigoted ideas, but requires far fewer people to be effective. Anti-immigrant groups, on the other hand, as I mentioned, like Federation for American Immigration Reform, attempt to work within the political and legal system. Within Oregon, there's an anti-immigrant group called Oregonians for Immigration Reform, which is a good example of this. And they're much more focused on their own power building than on using threatening rhetoric toward their political opposition. Instead, They used coded racist messaging and fear-mongering about crime and the alleged cost of immigration based on misleading research. One similarity to the Proud Boys, though, is that they try to portray their opposition as people who don't believe in the law, and they sometimes make efforts to neutralize their opposition by making overtures to communities of color. So each of these groups has an effect on how inclusive our democracy in this country is, and cuts to the core of it, right? Who is really seen as an American? And they also have an effect on which approaches for creating political change within our democratic system are reinforced, whether they're approaches that use arguments rather than bigotry to win debates, whether they're approaches that use nonviolent protests to gain attention, or that use violence, threats, and intimidation to attempt to cow their political opposition into submission. These approaches are not all the same and don't mean the same thing for the strength of our democracy. So as communities and as local governments, we have to take distinct approaches based on this. I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Amy Hertzfeld-Koppel, our Deputy Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives, to discuss white nationalist, alt-right, and paramilitary approaches to government.
Thanks, Lindsay. We have another 15 minutes or so for this section, including a pause again for your questions and reactions. As we continue to review the goals, strategies, and tactics of white nationalist, alt-right, and paramilitary movements, we'd like to turn your attention to two key areas of anti-democratic groups' organizing approaches. First, their approach to government, and second, their orientation toward using civil unrest to further stoke chaos and the concept of accelerationism. Let's talk about how these movements approach government first. While the specific motivations of different alt-right, white nationalists, and militia groups vary, they often have deeply anti-immigrant views, anti-government views, fueled by anti-government conspiracy theories. And they seek to undermine democratic governance and exhaust democratic institutions. As Eric shared earlier, we certainly think that goal has been evident in the intensity of incursions by far-right paramilitaries into Portland over the last 3 years. We know that violent rhetoric chills democratic practice and destabilizes community safety, and it's particularly threatening to vulnerable communities. But when directed toward public officials based on policy decisions, it must be seen as a direct threat to our democracy. We've been tracking instances of anti-government groups in our region making direct threats to elected leaders. And sadly, as mayor and commissioners, you're all too familiar with this disturbing trend. I'll share a few examples and apologies for the upsetting content. Leaders of the anti-government paramilitary group Patriot Prayer called for harassment and threats against prosecuting attorney Tony Golick of Clark County, Washington in August of 2018 in retaliation for charges filed against a Patriot Prayer supporter. Mayor Wheeler has been similarly targeted. An associate of the group said in a video that Wheeler's days were numbered, quote. A Washington Department of Justice employee was targeted for harassment in February of 2019 after testifying at a hearing enforcing I-1639, the gun safety ordinance approved by a majority of Washington state voters in 2018. Also last year, Washington 3% posted a wanted poster with a picture of Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson on their Facebook page. The poster called for followers to conduct a citizen's arrest, quote, citizen's arrest. Another post by Washington 3% on its Facebook page the same day read, quote, Bob Ferguson, we the people are not afraid of you. We will fight you. We will win or we will die. We are willing to give our lives for this cause, end quote. Lindsay just noted that a hallmark of anti-democratic groups is often accusing ideological opponents of exactly what the groups embody themselves or do to others. So we see authoritarian groups refer to political leadership as tyrants or make absurd comparisons to Nazis. We've tracked Twitter accounts referring to Governor Brown and Commissioner Hardesty as Nazis. We also see far-right extremist groups often issue threats or call for violence directed toward elected leaders or call for them to be arrested. For example, Haley Adams, a member of the far-right activist community in Portland, called for the arrest of Multnomah County District Attorney Mike Schmidt, Mayor Wheeler, and Governor Brown. Adams has also used more threatening language toward the mayor. Far-right Portland activist Chris Ponte posted, quote, "Joanne Hardesty is a danger to all patriots in Oregon," and that accompanied a flyer about a protest outside of Commissioner Hardesty's home. Marcus Edwards, an ally of the far-right, the American Patriot Society, also known as TAPS, invoked the dangerous QAnon conspiracy theory at a recent rally in Salem and called for Democrat leaders to be shot dead in the streets. That was a quote. We'll go deeper in the second session next Tuesday on how anti-democratic groups target municipal employees and law enforcement, but we know that far-right anti-government groups can be dangerous for law enforcement as well as communities and elected leaders. An ADL report in 2018 documented that 51 police officers have been killed by far-right extremist groups since 1990, in contrast to 11 officers killed by those claiming far-left beliefs. More recently, a Boogaloo adherent killed one officer and one federal security guard in Northern California in June. And we know that the potent combination of bigotry and violence central to the white nationalist movement is a serious threat to community and public safety. Now we'd like to address how white nationalists and paramilitary groups use civil unrest to further stoke chaos, gain political power, and accelerate their ideological vision through violence. We know that anti-democratic movements thrive when they can leverage fear and uncertainty within communities to broaden their political power and influence. We saw examples of this early in the COVID pandemic as militias around our region mobilized to oppose sensible public health measures, target officials, recruit new members, and mainstream their tactics. The pandemic has offered numerous openings to anti-government and other extremist groups, including white nationalists, xenophobic groups, conspiracy theorists, and more. And certainly the situation, the conditions play into far-right ideology and fears, which tend to center on perceived government overreach, infiltration by outsiders, a constant threat of societal collapse, and the need to stockpile supplies. We've also seen anti-government militias exploiting the pandemic to mainstream their appeal with groups like the Real 3%ers of Idaho and Washington 3% making food donations. As Eric shared, the social and economic disruptions right now are significant, and they're creating understandable fear and anxiety. Anti-government movements are trading on this fear and seeking to exacerbate it because it creates an opportunity for them to broaden their influence. While the militia tactics we're seeing now aren't new, they're especially troubling in such an unprecedented time in our lifetimes when society is already destabilized by the pandemic. Remember that anti-government groups often seek to replace civil infrastructure to serve their own vision of a more dangerous and exclusive society. The so-called patriot movement views events like the pandemic through the haze of anti-government conspiracy theories. It often uses messaging about patriotism and the Second Amendment as cover for extremist beliefs that are anti-democratic, often xenophobic, and opposed to the legitimacy of government bodies. Early in the summer, as mass civil protests emerged in support of the movement for Black lives and calling for an end to systemic racism, we saw anti-government militias in our region quickly pivot from organizing so-called reopen protests to spreading false stories about anti-fascist mobilizations, armed vigilantism, and blaming racial justice protesters for violence and looting. In small towns across our region, we saw troubling mobilizations by armed, sometimes heavily armed, anti-government activists like the 3%ers, Lightfoot Militia, and American Patriots, the 3%, patrolling downtowns and allegedly protecting businesses from false rumors of busloads of anti-fascists coming from Portland to places like Eugene, Klamath Falls, Spokane, Washington, and Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Militia movements, both historically and currently, have used the implicit or explicit threat of violence to chill democratic practice and undermine community safety. That's one reason why so many protests are armed. This strategy has also included threats and intimidation directed at public officials and civil servants. Militia movements have also attempted to co-opt local government and law enforcement, and sheriffs in particular, to get them to nullify the rule of law. And we can see some of these tactics at work today. Most recently, we saw dangerous false rumors blaming Oregon fires on anti-fascists, resulting in armed vigilantism in Multnomah and Clackamas counties. Another way that we see white nationalists and alt-right groups seeking to sow chaos and exploit disruption is through the concept of accelerationism, which claims that Western governments are corrupt, and as a result, white nationalists seek to accelerate their demise by creating chaos and political tension. Accelerationist ideas were cited in the Christchurch Killers Manifesto. The ultimate goal is to collapse the government itself. Accelerationists hope for a white-dominated future after that. For example, some members of the anti-government Boogaloo Boys see the nationwide racial justice protests as a kickoff for widespread upheaval and a civil war that they can accelerate in order for society to descend into chaos. For example, more recently, 3 Nevada men with ties to the Boogaloo movement were arrested in June on terrorism charges that federal authorities say was a conspiracy to spark violence during racial justice protests in Las Vegas. We want to pause here and see if you have any questions or reactions, and then I'll introduce our colleague and friend from Southern Poverty Law Center, Alicia Brooks, to share more.
Very good, colleagues. Any questions? Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Amy, for that presentation. You started to go here. We hear a lot of times when the Proud Boys come, they're coming to stand up for the police. And what we've seen on the street is that the police respond differently to Proud Boys traditionally than they do to left protesters. Do you have any data on whether or not we should be concerned about if law enforcement is actually reinforcing this white supremacist mindset? And if so, what's the solution to that?
Sure, Lindsay and Eric, you should feel free to jump in here too. And apologies, I of course realized that my video was off for my remarks, which I suppose is my, hopefully just my Zoom slip of the morning. And we can certainly bring additional studies and data to our next call. In fact, on our next session, we plan to go deeper into the threat of these groups to law enforcement, and we're inviting some guest experts, including retired law enforcement leaders, to speak to case studies. But it's true, we do see white nationalists, alt-right, and paramilitaries often express support with law enforcement, and that can be challenging to sort out, but it's really important to understand that these groups are a threat to law enforcement, right? And there are plenty of historic instances of these groups targeting law enforcement at their homes and even killing law enforcement. But it's really important to acknowledge that reality, and it's also important to address the perception of bias or actual bias by law enforcement, in support of anti-government militias or friendly, perceived or actual friendly interaction, especially in contrast to, a bias against racial justice protesters.
Commissioner Fritz.
You mentioned that there's been threats made to Mayor Wheeler, and some of those threats, at least, have been from people who claim to be on the left, and some of those also state that they want to demolish the government and return power to the people. Do you think that those people have infiltrated, or could you comment on that, please?
This is Eric Ward from Western State Center. I think this is an important question. Certainly, I think from our perception, what we have observed is that city government leaders and law enforcement have received threats of violence from across the political spectrum. The preponderance of that, though, at least from what we've observed and documented, seems to have come from the right. Now, it doesn't matter. the threat of violence is just simply unacceptable. And it is why civil society needs to speak up and to speak out against physical violence. I think it's also important for us to understand that right now in our country, right, that ideology has overtaken for many people the responsibility towards the common good in this moment, and the importance of value and our values over ideology. That takes recentering, and recentering comes from responsible leadership. And at the end of the day, while we can wait for those who choose to embrace violence to come, to come forward in new and different ways, I think we're more better focused on doing the things that we can do to provide alternatives to violence, right? And to practice de-escalation ourselves, right? That is ultimately how we set the standard. And that's a challenge. It's complex and it's hard. But at the end of the day, the standards that the city sets when it aligns with civil society appears to have real impact in our city. And we should not ignore that one gift in front of us.
Very good. Colleagues, any other questions? Commissioner Ryan.
Yeah, good morning. This has been great. I have some language that I just want to say that I'm grateful right now that you provided some language for perhaps what I've been feeling, and to hear terms like racial intimacy and how to be with that messiness. I also want to acknowledge the term about just being exhausted and as a tactic. And I'm going to speak to that on a very personal level. I live in North Portland. I'll just say maybe within a half mile of the police union headquarters. And there was a lot of noise last night, a lot of megaphones. Basically, I couldn't sleep. With this job, I care deeper than ever before about what's going on. So I put my mask on and got in my car and kind of snooped around at midnight. So I'm exhausted right now. And I think that I just want to make a comment that how do we lead when we experience this exhaustion? And when you see, when you experience this trauma of not feeling safe in your own home, and then you're aware that all these buildings that you're looking at while you're driving, many of them are boarded up. And so it is affecting our economy. And I just don't think we provide the space for having these vulnerable conversations as leaders. And I just want to say I appreciate that. And maybe some advice for how on a day like this, I'm not reactionary because I haven't given myself the self-care necessary, which is called a decent night of sleep. And so I guess I want to just say that I'm experiencing that anxiety that's natural and that exhaustion at this very moment. And I'm perplexed about what I saw last night. And so I'm just feeling really in it at the moment. And as a white ally, I want to keep doing my best to show up with humility, sincerity, and courage. And on this morning in this dialogue, I'm just feeling exhausted.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan, and here. Commissioner Udaley.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to bring up a couple quick points, and we don't need to go deeply into them, but they're just a couple thoughts generated by the presentation so far. One is, we know that some individuals in our police bureau and in bureaus across the country identify politically, culturally, whatever, more with the right than the left. And we have seen in Portland on a number of occasions disparate treatment of right-wing and left-wing protesters. And I think it's easy to jump to conclusions about why that is. And again, I'm not going to deny that there are some within the Bureau who may absolutely identify with right-wing protesters, but we also, there are other factors involved, such as, although these right-wing extremists seem equally bent on, destroying our systems of government, they're more likely to respect and comply with the law, and they're more likely to be armed. And as you mentioned, police officers themselves are 5 times more likely to be victims of right-wing extremist violence than left-wing. I was actually surprised to hear the number for left-wing. I think it was previously much, much lower. The real threat of violence for years, we know, have been right-wing extremists. So I just want to put it out there that our law enforcement officers also experience fear and anxiety for their safety from right-wing extremists. And then the comment I want to make on violence on the left, which is typically on violence and, I guess, vandalism and property destruction, I want to be sure to draw a clear distinction between that, is that they will say whatever they are doing in the name of this cause is not, is justified by the violence being done against Black communities and other communities by the state. And when I talk about the violence happening in our community, I'm absolutely talking about police as well as any violence that happens on the protester side. So just a couple issues that I'm personally wrestling with and could use guidance on, or maybe I think it's just important to publicly acknowledge some of these dynamics. It's more complex, I think, than is often kind of portrayed in these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. And Amy, I don't know if you or somebody else want to respond to Commissioner Daly's question about seeking guidance.
Sure. Yeah, you bet. We've, I think my being off video started all these glitches because Eric just lost his Wi-Fi and Leisha had to jump off for another call. So we're improvising a little here. Yeah, we are certainly planning in the next session to address threats and complexities with law enforcement more directly, and wanted in this, this set of sort of questions and reflections to hear what challenges you're facing so that we can tailor some of the next session to addressing those. But really appreciate you acknowledging and holding that complexity. It's something that we were trying to figure out the best way to bring into the space too.
Thank you. And if everyone could mute who's not speaking, there's some really irritating background noise going on. Thank you.
So I'll jump in. Maybe it's more of a comment than it is a question. Much of our focus today has been around the more visible and more obvious manifestations of white supremacy. But since we're going to be doing this training citywide and we're going to be engaging all of our bureaus, in fact, we have most of our bureau directors on this call this morning, I hope we'll also talk about the institutional manifestations of white supremacy that are less visible than somebody charging through the streets wearing a neo-Nazi uniform. That's pretty obvious. It's in your face, and it's a clear and present danger. But a lot of what we work with on the city council and at the city of Portland within our bureaus is institutional white supremacy. And that's the structures of governance, the ease or lack of ease of access, outcomes that are either equitable or are predetermined negatively based on race or racial bias or other institutional mechanisms that people may not be aware are inherently white supremacist. Could you talk a little bit about that and where you see the training going, looking at some of, moving away from the visible hate groups towards what I think is an ever-present and insidious structural form of white supremacy and racism that holds a lot of people in our community back. And we could talk about that in the context of city bureaus. We could talk about it in education. We could talk about it in access to capital. We could talk about it in terms of wealth building or access to housing. It just seems like there's a lot of institutional and structural impediments to people of color being able to achieve the same results as others in our community.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And as Eric discussed, there's obviously a huge amount of intersection between structural and institutional white supremacy and the ways that white nationalists and alt-right groups organize and how they seek to build power. And I think we're as Eric has mentioned, there's an incredible amount of opportunity, I think, for the city to take on both of those at the same time in the way that they intersect, as there is for local communities as well. And we'll certainly make space to talk about some of that in the remainder of the discussion today and next week. Amy or Eric, if you'd like to add more to, feel free. As maybe I think it makes sense to move on the more formal discussion piece at the end of the session.
And that would be fine. But before we move on, I see Commissioner Hardesty also has her hand raised. And Dan and Chloe, if you could lower your hands unless you want another round of questioning.
Thank you, Mayor. My question is really around the backlash that we will experience at the City of Portland and City of Portland leaders because of the resolution and the intentionality we have about centering BIPOC communities. And it hasn't played out yet, but I know it's coming. And I know there's going to be this backlash from folks who are feeling like, oh, so now the whole city council is being politically correct and I'm not going to get my needs met. And so how do you give us tools to actually respond to what we know is coming down the pipeline?
It looks like Eric's speaking, but you're on mute, Eric.
Sorry, Commissioner Hardesty. I would say that, we will hear from individuals who we've brought in for the training who will be talking about their experiences. So one, a law enforcement officer from England who has experience in addressing hate crimes and far-right mobilization there. Also an individual from Ireland who will be joining us, who for decades worked dealing with sectarian violence and mobilizations, and some tips, specific tips and practices to addressing that type of confrontation. I think what we have to understand in terms of specific tips where we understand that this is not merely about symbology, is that there are many rules on the city policies that can come into play right now. I believe that they need to be reviewed and assembled. And we saw some of these at work over the past weekend, right? Preventing people from using cars with no front or back license plates are very key. What has allowed folks to function in such a way is using vehicles as weapons or places of intimidation are the feeling of being anonymous and darkened windshield windows and taking off of license plates has been one way. So we think that there are a number of practices that can be instituted. Some of them are larger than the city, and it's going to take, I think, city leadership pressuring state and federal government. We've observed in some of these protests, individuals using paint ball guns from moving vehicles in groupings. And while to some it may appear to come across as an alt-right speak as owning the libs or just an escalation in direct action, confrontation, it is also true from my observation that it looks like paramilitary training, that individuals have substituted paintball guns instead of live weapons and are actually practicing on the streets of Portland. I believe that may be in violation of state anti-paramilitary training laws. I am not a legal expert, but that is what it appears to me. And so I would just say to suggest we will hear some specific tips and suggestions from those who have been immersed in that work outside the US. I think that is a helpful perspective. But at the end of the day, as I've said to city governments and communities across the country, I actually think we have the tools. They just have not been assembled into a single toolbox. And we hope to lift up some of those specific tools in the next training specifically, those that do exist and are at the disposal of the city of Portland.
Thank you, Eric.
Are there any additional comments or questions, or should we move on to the next piece?
Looks like you're good to go.
Great. So unfortunately, we're a bit behind schedule, so lost our colleague Leisha Brooke another meeting, and we'll fold her section into the training. We want to move on now to the formal discussion section, and there's a series of a few questions on the slide deck that we'd like to raise up. In this context of our discussion and the training, thinking really specifically about what the impact has been on Portland of anti-democratic activity. What's the impact on public transit, parks and public space, public safety? What has the economic impact been? Sort of going through for each bureau and an aspect of city government, as a forerunner of what Eric mentioned, the need to take a look at all city policies and how they're impacted and what possibilities there are for strengthening the city as a democratic institution against anti-democratic incursions. So I'll leave it now to everyone to share if you have specific thoughts to share or observations around these impacts.
I could just say, I think we've left out mental health because the impact on individuals' mental health and collectively has been severe. And that's not a piece that we talk about, right? The silencing and isolation of people because they are under attack nonstop by folks who don't necessarily live here, but are having a huge impact on their ability to work, to worship, to engage in the community like they would normally do. every time there's a announcement that white supremacists are coming to Portland and white nationalists are scheduling a march, you can see the real fear and tension because they don't just go where they say they're going to go. We've started seeing them split off and actually attack people who have Black Lives Matters t-shirts or just don't have 45 t-shirts on, right? They just assume that's so. It is having a huge impact on the mental well-being of community members and honestly leaders, as well as leaders within the city of Portland and throughout the city.
Commissioner Udaley.
Yeah, I have similar comments. Just the level of stress and anxiety and trauma and grief that I'm seeing among my friends and community and my constituents is it's extraordinary and it's very painful to see. I was listening to young Black community leaders and advocates in a listening session that Commissioner Hardesty held recently, and one of the participants used a metaphor that I know I'm going to get wrong, but it was something like, imagine going to your home and not seeing a picture of yourself. It was about representation and how members of the Black community don't feel represented, reflected, or visible. And I was just thinking, imagine if those pictures you see are mugshots or memorials of people who do look like you. Just the daily focus on violence against Black lives. I mean, it is also a hopeful moment of change, but it's really rough, and especially for young people who are out there protesting, putting their physical and mental health and safety at risk. I think we need to address that. And I'll just say, I think people just in general feel less safe in public. I encountered a group of the right-wing extremists who came to town a few weeks ago, their big caravan around 14th and Burnside, in their giant trucks, revving their engines, yelling at and harassing just random passersby, people who are not engaging with them. It's clear that they intend to just harass and intimidate and threaten people. And we certainly don't need that right now. Civic engagement in some ways is at an all-time high, which is notable considering we can't gather in public, but we're definitely hearing from more people. And I think our city employees are really stressed out too, especially BIPOC community members, but also anyone who's on the front lines of these conflicts. There's just a lot of anxiety and grief in the community right now.
Thanks, Commissioner Udaley. I'll chime in here as well. You mentioned the impact on the community, on local business. I went around with a group of small business owners and operators on Friday, and I think all of them, or almost all of them, were business owners and operators who are people of color. And so they're feeling a double blow here. And what I heard reflected by them was they are extremely concerned about the nightly violence that's going on in the city of Portland, the impact it's having on the reputation of the city, the way it's being magnified in large measure as a citywide problem by some national news outlets, about how COVID had already cut off travel and tourism, but that even as travel and tourism from Washington and California starts to increase, they don't feel that, particularly in areas that are associated with the demonstrations, the downtown area and other parts of the city, they're not seeing business come back. And that is deeply concerning to them. What they also expressed is it is counter to the brand or the way that people perceive the city of Portland. They perceive the city as being innovative and creative and inclusive and having a great arts and culture community, a city of people who care about each other and who are tolerant. And they're concerned that brand is being directly challenged nationally and internationally by others who are seeking to rebrand us. And we're seeing a lot of that. And Eric, you mentioned that in your talking points, particularly leading up to the November election. But I just want to relate to folks that for the small businesses in this community, which employ something like 80% of this is a real concern. They're concerned that even after assuming the demonstrations settle down, assuming the nightly violence is brought under control, they're concerned that the damage could be lasting for Portland families and particularly small business owners and operators. So I just want to report that back to the council because that's what I'm hearing loudly and clearly. And I also, Commissioner-elect Rubio, I don't want you to be on the spot, but I also don't want you to feel excluded. You're already part of this team. So if you have any thoughts or questions at any point, please feel free just to raise your hand. Commissioner Udeh, did you raise your hand again or did I get that wrong?
I did, but I'd love to give Commissioner-elect Rubio a chance to speak before I comment, if she wants to.
Thank you, Commissioner Udaley and Mayor Wheeler. I haven't figured out how to raise my hand, so I apologize for that. I also just want to chime in and say that mental health, in particular for vulnerable communities, and the re-traumatization of vulnerable populations and BIPOC based on multi-generational trauma of institutional racism and oppression. So all this feels like a lot, and even our frontline community advocates and organizations are even struggling themselves because they're going through these experiences and feelings while still continuing to serve community. So I just want to call out that remains a very specific kind of tension and work too. So acknowledging that there is exhaustion in a lot of our communities who are actively having these discussions with community as well. And just, I've been listening and to all these questions and conversations, and I'm just so grateful that we live in a community where we are having these in public spaces, and really looking forward to the next presentation about tactical ways that we can move forward.
Thank you, Commissioner-elect Rubio. And before I move to Commissioner Daly, the way I have found it, and there's probably shortcuts that I'm not aware of, but if I click on the participants button at the bottom, then it gives the opportunity to raise the hand at the bottom of the participant bar. There's probably an easier way to do it, but that always works for me. Commissioner Daly.
I'll try to make this really quick. I am also very concerned about our small businesses and local economy, but the real threat to them is the COVID crisis and the associated economic crisis. There's no doubt that small business owners or business owners, all business owners in very specific areas of the city, such as the area surrounding the location of many of the nightly protests downtown, and perhaps some in North and East Portland, but there haven't been the kind of ongoing protests we've seen downtown, are being impacted by the protests, or at least the public perception of the protests. But this is a national issue, not a Portland issue, as far as the impact to small businesses. And the claims by PBA were proven wrong by the Oregonians. So I just want to assert that a little bit, that the protests are not the real threat to our local businesses and economy. And I'd also, I don't know if this is the place to say this, but I'm going to say it. The protests aren't going to stop until the protesters are satisfied with the level of change that we commit to as local leaders. I think it would be extremely helpful to hear from the police bureau and the police union an acknowledgement of their past harms, an acknowledgement that they need to do better, and some of the suggestions they want to put on the table. So far, all I have seen is defensive posturing, in particular from the union, who remains our biggest challenge to reform, our biggest barrier to reform. And, you know, no disrespect meant to Chief Lavelle. I think he's handling this as well as he can, but it's gaslighting the community to continue to assert that everything that's been done to them in the name of law enforcement is legal and ethical and moral and justifiable. And acknowledging that is literally the first step to correcting it. And they haven't even taken the first step. So I don't want to take us too far off the right-wing extremist conversation, but I think it's all part of this. The more united we are as elected leaders, working hand in hand with our community, the safer our community is going to be, the more progress we're going to make with police, and the greater our ability to neutralize the threat from right-wing extremists.
Thank you, Commissioner Udaley. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Udaley. I absolutely agree with what you just said. I have noticed, even in having conversations with business owners, that they are picking up the rhetoric around nightly riots. Right? The police, Portland police, developed this narrative that every night they're under attack. And so as I've been meeting with other constituents, I'm shocked that they are actually incorporating this national narrative about the nightly riots. And so what that does is actually spread misinformation, because we had a riot once, and that was the very first night of protest. And in my mind, we have not had a riot since. But when you have the Police Bureau daily putting out press releases that reinforce this national narrative, that reinforces 45's position about Portland being out of control, then we have our community actually embracing that national narrative. And so I think part of the challenge is giving people real information and real facts, so that they're not picking it up from Fox News or from Portland Police Twitterers or from other institutions that are intentionally misleading the public about what's really going on. And let me just say, since we're in this conversation, I do not equate a few people throwing things at police to being a reason to declare riots and brutalize hundreds of people because a few people have committed some acts that they should be arrested and prosecuted for. And so I think part of our job as elected leaders and as leaders within the city of Portland is to not buy into that national narrative and not allow our employees to actually regurgitate information that we know simply is not true. And so helping us figure out how we make sure that we're not actually feeding into 45's narrative about what's going on in Portland every night. There's way too much video evidence to prove otherwise, that the people that are being attacked are not in uniforms. And so I think as a city, we are disconnected from what's really happening on the ground, because if we're only reading the narratives that are created within the police bureau, it paints a very narrow picture of what's happening. And I think that's part of the council's disconnect from what we need to do policy-wide to make sure that that the police response is appropriate to the activity that's taking place. And I know the mayor and I have been working very hard to try to make sure that there's really clear lines. But clearly, law enforcement in Portland, and I would say all over the country, have this perception that somehow they don't work for anybody, that they're the bosses of their bosses. And there's nothing you can do about that as a organization, but maybe you can help us actually get that kind of information out of the presenters that were either currently police or former police officers about how they were able to shift that public narrative, because I think that's our biggest disadvantage. When I speak to the head of Travel Portland, and he tells me, well, the riots every night are really killing our business. I'm like, wait a minute, what riots every night? What are you talking about, right? And so I think that's a barrier that we're gonna have to just intentionally address, and we're gonna have to address it through policy, because I don't think the police are gonna change without us changing policy that makes them actually have an appropriate response to what they are seeing on the street.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Fritz, then Commissioner Ryan.
Thank you, Mayor. My understanding is we're going to go more into the police issues next week, and I look forward to that. I want to address what's on the slide here about the impact of anti-democratic activity on Portland. For instance, just this past weekend, the massive response that was required from multiple bureaus just because of the threat, which was managed really well. And I applaud Mayor Wheeler and the entire team for planning it so well, as well as the community members who chose to demonstrate peacefully in other places. They chose not to engage. It was really unfortunate that then there was some activity that claims to be in support of democracy later in the evening that then brought the attention back on Portland is out of control. There has been significant impact on public transit from the demonstrations. There has been significant impact on parks, Chapman and Lonsdale, just not usable at this point. And other public spaces as well. The emergency services we know have been challenged. Civic engagement certainly has been challenged. There's people are engaging, and they are engaging in ways that are frightened and angry and despairing. And I found the presentation at the beginning really inspiring. Also, I found Mayor Wheeler's comments at the end of the budget forum inspiring as to what good can come out of turmoil. And I appreciate that we have, as a council, been focusing on human rights and racial equity. I appreciated the three strategies that are crucial to how we start addressing these things. We need to find ways to work together. And I agree with, Commissioner Udeh said that we need to be united. We need to have the discussions about what that means. And so, and I see that Dr. Smith also wants to comment, so I'll be quiet. And Commissioner Ryan, and then Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Commissioner Fritz. Commissioner Ryan, then Dr. Smith.
Yes, I want to actually look at this question and acknowledge what was said earlier, and how the anti-government forces, the militias, all these groups, they're anti-government, anti-civics, anti-humanitarian. And so when they first were against, people wearing masks in basic science, then it shifted to the civil unrest. And then when I got clear that that was a strategy was definitely during the wildfires. My point is, it was really helpful that you again framed that for us. And I don't think the general public has that understanding. And so, yes, the impact of anti-democratic activity in Portland is really evident. And like my colleagues, it's a national phenomena. And I don't think we're doing a good enough job explaining how these forces are coming together and are just anti-government, anti-humanitarian, anti-civil, and whatever is happening. And I do want us in the next session and in planning how we are poised to keep our city civilized and safe on the night of the election and right after the election. It's terrifying to think about the tactics that are brewing from these extreme groups. So thank you for these, again, getting language for what a lot of us are experiencing. I appreciate this training very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Dr. Smith.
Yes, I'll make this really quick. I know we're running out of time. There were just kind of three things that were coming up for me. And the first is I recently, actually last week, crafted a piece around my struggle right now with really this First Amendment right to free speech and how in a lot of ways it is a catalyst for anti-Blackness. It is a catalyst for racist acts, for just a lot of what we're seeing. And so I think about for myself, right, what does the Constitution really mean to me and to other people of color? Like how has it really protected? Is it, knowing that it was not originally designed with us in mind? And so I've been struggling a lot about just our idea around democracy, right, and how this looks. The second piece is, I know we have some guests that are coming in our next session that represent, police and have been former police officers. And I think at some point it would be really helpful to engage our local officers in that conversation, as that perspective, right, is really relevant to what we're talking about right now. And then my third point is just, and it's been echoed here, there is, I think a collective acknowledgement of grief and overwhelm. There have been no breaks, right? Black folks have never really had breaks, and we're really seeing this play out. I'm thinking about Breonna Taylor, there's just a lot. And so I think we have to be cognizant of that as we are entering into these conversations and really thinking about what is the impact, right? And what are we seeing happen in our community? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And we are pushing up to the tail end of our 2-hour training session. I'll ask if there was anything else from the folks engaged in the training, whether there was anything else they wanted to include before we get to some concluding remarks.
Sure, we'll turn it over to Eric Ward for a brief closing.
Thank you.
And Eric, you might be muted.
I feel like that is my bad virtual idiom right there. I want to thank everyone today for joining us. And to recap, the purpose of this part one of the training was to look at definitions and to look at shared definitions, to revisit what the purpose and ideology of the white nationalist movement, alt-right, and paramilitary groups are, and what impact it has had on Portland. As we move forward into the next segment of the training, we will look specifically at recommendations and case studies. And we're excited because we believe that's where we will spark some ideas that will generate conversation around real policies and movement. I want to thank all of the elected officials, commissioners, Mayor Wheeler for joining us today. I want to thank all of the Bureau leaders. We know that your time is precious and the work is heavy. Again, we want to thank all of those in the community and all those who are civil servants who work each and every day to strengthen our community and to make it prosper. Again, this these two segments are not about pointing fingers. If government has stumbled in this critical moment, the private sector and civil society has proved itself in many ways to be uncaring. And too often in those ways that we do care, we are often more fascinated by the spectacle and the theatrics of extremism and anti-democratic movements than our role in working with government to counter this on behalf of our communities. While it did not start in the last 4 years, it will take years for us to recover from this moment. And we here in Oregon are not the exception. However, we in Oregon, and particularly those of us in Portland, we do have the opportunity to be the model, not just for our state, but for the entire nation. From Texas to Iowa to Wisconsin to California, many local governments find themselves struggling with many of these same questions. It's our time right now for Portland and our civil society to put forth our best imagination and creativity. It's time for us to rebuild. And this coming together today was the first step in rebuilding all of our insistence on responsive government. And I thank you so much for inviting us and trusting us to reflect with you all today.
Thank you, Eric, very much for that. And also to Lindsay, Amy, and Alicia, thank you for putting together this training and being informative. I don't know if any of my colleagues would like to make any comments before we close this out. Colleagues? Commissioner Hardesty?
Thank you. I just want to thank all my directors for making it a priority to be on this call today. I am very grateful. I know how busy you are and how overwhelmed you are, but I am grateful that you made the time to be here. So thank you, and thank everybody else for being here. And thank you, Western State Center. This has been fascinating so far. I can't wait till next Tuesday to get to the other part.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Anybody else before we close out? Not seeing any hands, so I will just remind everybody part 2 of this training series will happen next Tuesday, which is October 6th already, believe it or not, next Tuesday, October 6th at 9:30 a.m. Thank you all for your participation. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Mayor, did you want us to stay on? Did you have a plan for the city council after this presentation?
I don't think I did. Hang on.
I heard that you wanted us to do a shoot a short video.
You did?
Yeah.